Hello again, everyone, and welcome to our next module here in Foundations of Moral Theology. And what I want to do today is give you sort of an introduction to our discussion of sexual ethics. This was one of the topics that people expressed an interest in at the beginning of the course, and obviously, unless you've been living under a log for quite a while, this is one of the areas where there is the most controversy. Really in our culture as a whole. And also, it is, I think, pretty certainly the case that this is the issue where there's the most intense conflict between sort of a Catholic ethical approach to the issues and the broader culture's take on those issues, right? So, this is really obviously something that is important to deal with. So, it would be great to be able to spend a whole course looking at this, but we don't really have the time to do that in this program. So, and also even in this module, there's no way we're going to be able to cover everything. So really what I want to do in this video is just spell out some key things to keep in mind as you read the articles and responses to them and then get into your discussion. And again, just make sure this is clear. This module is a little unusual in that you can sort of take two different tracks in going through the readings and discussions. So you can either focus on the issue of contraception, or you can focus on the issue of same-sex relationships. So you don't have to do all the articles and things listed there in the readings. You either pick one set or the other, and then discuss that. Now, of course, if you want to do both, you're welcome to do that, but you're only required to do one of them. So just I want to make sure that is clear. But the underlying issues are going to be very similar, and so hopefully we can still have some sort of coherent overall discussion as a group, even if people are working on slightly different specific questions. But again, there's just a few things I want to emphasize to kind of lay the groundwork for those discussions, right? And one is just to bring our attention back to what we've done in the course up to this point, right? And that is looking at Waddell's presentation of Catholic ethics, which I think is done in a way that is very useful for engaging the broader culture or skeptics or even critics, right? And I think one thing that I would emphasize in terms of how to engage on these topics well would be to sort of use him as a model, right? So to come into it with a focus not on here's the list of rules and here's the punishments that you get for breaking those rules, but rather explaining, offering a narrative, right? Offering a larger story of how a particular way of life should work and what are going to be the positive outcomes from living in a proper way and giving good examples. And maybe most of all, living out good examples that people are going to find appealing and attractive and are going to want to emulate. And if I could say nothing else about it, I think what the church needs more than anything else, more than a really slick website or social media campaign, would be lots of positive lived out examples of these things that we're talking about, right? Because I think that is going to be much more persuasive for most people than a formal argument. And now, of course, it's good to understand the arguments behind these things, so it's still good for us to do this, but I would say that is probably the first thing, right? And really focusing on, even when we get into the ethics and the natural law reasoning, reflecting on how it's not just about following the rules for the rules' sake, but that all of this is aimed at our real flourishing as persons, right? And that flourishing happens most through our emulation of God, through self-sacrificial love, right? And it's through that sort of complete love of the other that we most fulfill God's image in us, right? And so that is really the ultimate goal of life and ethics as a whole, and it is, in a particular way, the focus of sexual ethics, right? And so again, we want to make sure that we don't get caught up in some of the rules and the arcane details in a way that distracts us from that larger purpose, right? And I think a lot of times these conversations get hijacked by debates over the details of the rules, and a lot of it could be addressed by shifting our focus back to, okay, what is the real purpose of this teaching in the first place? And so I think it's important for us to keep an emphasis on that. Now, again, I'm going to assume that most of us at this point kind of know the basics. I will add a link to the U.S. Catholic Bishop's website on marriage and sexuality, and it really provides a sort of overview of the Catholic positions on the basics of sexual morality, if that would be helpful for anyone. So I will provide that on Canvas. I'm going to assume that most of us already know that. So I just want to highlight a couple of things to keep in mind as we get into these specific controversies about contraception and same-sex relationships. Right. So first off is to think about the history, right? And I think one of the challenges for Catholics in the 21st century in addressing these issues is that we have grown up, most Catholics now have grown up entirely in the era of theology of the body, right? So theology of the body was a movement, a set of teachings created by John Paul II. So it has been going on for 40, 50 years now at this point, which is kind of crazy. And so many people have grown up without ever experiencing Catholic teaching about sexuality prior to theology of the body, right? And I think it's important to be aware that in previous generations, the Catholic Church's teaching on sexuality was much, I mean, again, this is a gross generalization. There are counterexamples to be sure, but largely it was negative, and largely it was focused on prohibitions, right? And if you took the church history courses, you're maybe familiar with St. Augustine, and he has a very critical view of even married sexuality, and that has filtered through much of the tradition since Augustine's time, and really even before Augustine as well. And so for a lot of reasons that we don't have the time to get into in great detail, but also having to do a lot with Greek philosophy that significantly influences Christian theology, and there's a bias against the body and against bodily things in much of Greek philosophy. A lot of that is incorporated into theology as it develops. And so there is a bias against the body and against sexuality in particular for a lot of church tradition. And so when we encounter the culture and the culture's assumption that the Catholic Church is just adamantly opposed to all things sexual, that can be confusing for some Catholics who hear about how it's part of God's beautiful plan, it's how we grow in holiness, all these things. We need to be aware that that wasn't the emphasis of the Church's teaching for quite a long time, at least in most places in the Church over the centuries. Now, again, as I said, there's this big shift with John Paul II and theology of the body, which I would say is sort of a correction or a balance to some of the prohibition sort of focused teaching, right? And John Paul II really emphasized that marriage is part of God's original plan for human beings, that sexuality and marriage are not inherently sinful, right? And that it is, in fact, a good and even grace-giving aspect of human life, right? And that in marriage, the couple can benefit physically, emotionally, and spiritually through their married life, through a sexual relationship within the marriage, right? And so this was a really big development in the Church's teaching and presentation of marriage and sexuality, and it has had a profound impact on the way the Church has dealt with these issues since then. And again, it's been going on for decades now, but one thing that is true of the Catholic Church is it often takes a while for some of these things to really work their way through the system, if you will. And so I think we are still working out the implications of a lot of that teaching. And so that is part of what's going on in a lot of the debate around sexual ethics within the Church and in the Church in conversation with the culture, right? Is that we have had this really big development in recent memory, which opens up the possibility of, could these developments go further? Is there room for additional development or even change, some might argue, in the church's teaching, right? And so that's part of why these issues are so debated right now is a lot of people have a memory of a pretty significant development, and so they want to know, can we take this further? So that's part of what's going on as well, right? Of course, we also need to keep in mind not just theology of the body, but the sort of biggest moment, the biggest inflection point, whatever you want to call it, in modern Catholic theology is the promulgation of Humanae Vitae by Paul VI. So in the 1970s, Paul VI writes this encyclical Humanae Vitae, which was really anticipated, right? This was being followed in the news. He had a commission that he brought together to prepare for this document. So this was actually a lot of people were watching and waiting for what Paul VI was going to say. Was the Catholic Church going to change its teaching on the permissibility of artificial contraception? Because in the previous decades, every other major Christian denomination and tradition had come to accept the use of artificial contraception. So the expectation was that Paul VI would do the same. The commission that he put together to study the issue issued a report where the majority approved or said that yes, the church should allow for this, at least in certain circumstances. So all of this built up, and then Paul VI issues the encyclical Humanae Vitae and says no, right? He says the church is not going to approve of artificial contraception. And this was a huge moment in theology, and particularly in moral theology. And really kind of, you can trace all of the history of Catholic moral theology since the 1970s, and it really all pivots around how we respond to Humanae Vitae. Most of those who dissent from or critique the church's ethical teaching, that grows out of a rejection of this position on Humanae Vitae, and the defense of the traditional Catholic teaching really codifies around a defense of Humanae Vitae. So it really does kind of define Catholic moral thinking from then until now to a large extent. Now, having said that, right, hopefully you can understand why this was seen as really problematic by some people, as a ultimate stand against the modern sexual free love movement of the 60s by others, right? So it really was a very weighted, very hefty controversy. But I think what also a lot of people miss in this debate is that Humanae Vitae does still represent a very significant development in the church's teaching on sexuality, right? Because I give you a link to it. You can read the actual encyclical, although I'm not going to require it. But one of the striking things that you find there is that really, if you look at most of the tradition up to that point, when we talk about, well, what is the end? What is the purpose of sexuality? And by extension, what is the purpose of marriage? The real focus is on procreation, right? That God sets up marriage, God sets up sexuality within the marriage for the purpose of procreation, for having children. And that is sort of the standard teaching throughout the centuries. What you see in Humanae Vitae is instead of just one end for marriage and sexuality, we get a recognition of two distinct proper ends for sexuality, right? That is procreation, but also union of the spouses, right? The union of the two persons on a physical, but also an emotional and relational, spiritual even level, right? That the union of the spouses is a proper purpose and end of sexuality. And so this is a really important development, right? Because it recognizes that there is more to marriage, there is more to sexuality than just having children, which again was a stereotype of the Catholic view for a very long time. And to be fair, is kind of the impression you would get from reading a lot of the Catholic material prior to this. And so this was a real recognition of a reality that obviously many Catholic people had lived, but which wasn't really expressed clearly in the official teaching. But it also does set the stage for a lot of the subsequent debate and disagreement, right? Because when you set it up so that there are at least two proper ends for sexuality, procreation and the unitive end, um, one of the questions that gets raised is, well, is it possible to have moral marriage or sexuality where you attain that unitive end but not the procreative, right? So we get a real union of persons, but not necessarily the procreation, right? And this opens a very big debate. Now, one immediate response might be to say, well, no, you can't just have one, you have to have both, right? And you'll see this, obviously, this issue is at the heart of both of these controversies I'm asking you to take a look at, right? Because in the debate about contraception, right, this is obviously central, right? Is can you have moral sexual relationships when you are intentionally prohibiting, restricting the procreative nature of the acts? Because one of the arguments will be, well, you can have couples who are pursuing the unitive end, but for various reasons don't want or can't pursue the procreative end. And so can that be moral, right? The immediate response might be to say, well, no, obviously not. One of the challenges, though, there that you'll see in the materials, if you look at this issue, is that there are obviously cases where there can be moral sexual relations that don't have a real procreative potential. So, for example, we would say that married couples can continue to morally have sexual relationship after the woman goes through menopause, right? So, after menopause, there is not going to be physical procreation, barring a miraculous intervention like Abraham and Sarah. And so, critics will point to this and say, look, you have a situation there where you have a couple pursuing the unitive end. But obviously there's not real procreative potential there. There are also all kinds of situations where one or the other or both persons have some sort of medical condition that makes procreation not physically possible. And in those cases, we would still say that it is moral for them to have a sexual relationship within their marriage, right? So critics of the teaching would say, if a couple has very serious reasons for avoiding procreation, whether it's a very serious health issue for the woman or severe poverty with the possibility of the child or family starving if another child were born, or severe mental health issues, any number of things, couldn't we argue that they ought to be able to have the unitive good of marital sexuality without the procreative, right? And that's where a lot of the debate is going to happen. And what does it mean to have the procreative end, right? So we obviously, if you look at what the church's teaching says, for those couples who, for our example, are infertile apart from their will, right, not willing it, it just has happened, the church will say, well, you can be procreative in having a fruitful relationship that supports the community and you reach out to others, and there are other ways of being procreative besides biological generation of children. And so again, critics are going to say, couldn't the same thing be true of couples that use procreation for, or use contraception for serious reasons, or even same-sex couples who they would argue can have this unitive connection in a sexual relationship but don't have the procreative? Can't they be procreative in the same sense that a postmenopausal or infertile heterosexual couple could be, right? And so that is going to be one of the main arguments. Now, again, I will let you go through those readings and you can discuss. I do think it's important to recognize that these are difficult issues to sort out, and I think, to be fair, we should be able to understand why many people would see some overlap there and wonder why, if one is permissible, the other is not. I do think we can work this out more in the discussion. It's worth noting that there is a difference between a sort of accepting an unchosen lack of fertility versus sort of intentionally pursuing sexual relations in a way that don't include the possibility of procreation, or intentionally inhibiting the procreative aspect. So one of the issues I've often used, or one example I've often used to work with this in previous courses, right, is what about, I often use the example of eating a peanut butter cup, right? And so how does that tie in? Well, look, if you had a situation where a person had met all of their dietary needs ideally for the day, and then they're faced with there's a peanut butter cup on the counter, and this person loves peanut butter cups. They're clearly the best candy. And can they eat it just for the enjoyment, right? And so this would be pursuing the end of enjoyment, but it'd be pursuing it in a way that doesn't fit with the primary end of eating, which is maintenance of health, right? So you could set up this example where is it okay to eat this peanut butter cup, to enjoy it, even if it's going to put you a bit over your ideal caloric intake? So in some way, it would be contrary to the promotion of your bodily health, right? And we could flesh this out in more detail if we want, but I think most of us would have the impression that, yes, on occasion, it's okay to eat a dessert, a candy, simply for the enjoyment that it provides, right? That's not intrinsically immoral. So if that's true, critics would say, why would it be wrong for couples to occasionally engage in the goods of sexuality apart from procreation, but without the procreative aspect that they are eliminating through contraception, right? How are those disanalogous? And I think one thing to point out here, right, is that there is, in fact, I think ultimately a difference, right? And that the contraception would be more akin to eating the peanut butter, chewing up the peanut butter cup, and then spitting it out, or even making yourself sick, right? So binging and purging, right? So you aren't just pursuing the one good but not the other. In the case of artificial contraception, at least, you are pursuing the one good and actively working against the other, right? And so I think if you are finding yourself eating a peanut butter cup for the enjoyment, but then forcing yourself to vomit to avoid the health repercussions, I do think that actually is problematic, right? And that would raise red flags in a similar way, right? So maybe something you could think about, respond to in the discussions if you find that interesting. Okay, real quick, because I'm going on for a while here, just a couple other things to close out the discussion as you head into the readings, right? So one, we've talked about why there's so much objection on these issues in terms of like how the doctrine has developed in recent decades. I think another thing to look at is a lot of critics will say, well, look, this teaching hasn't been accepted by many or even most Catholics. Most surveys show like 90% of Catholics or so don't follow the church's teaching on contraception. So how do we account for this, right? And does this indicate that this isn't an authentic teaching? And there are people who debate this extensively. I think one thing that is worth recognizing is if we really want to change how the people live out the faith, I think one thing to look at is, in terms of what we've been doing in this course, have we been building the virtues to make this kind of right living possible, right? And I think a lot of people have focused on, oh, we need to explain the teachings better, which we certainly should always explain as well as we can. But I think if you look at our practice, I think, and it makes sense if you understand the nature of Catholic morality and the virtues, you have to build the virtues in order for people to be able to live virtuously, right? And I think we have spent very little time as American Christians teaching people to resist bodily pleasures or temptations for the attainment of virtue or higher goods, right? And we allow people to do whatever they want when it comes to how they eat, how they shop, how they practice most aspects of their lives, right? We call for very little restraint. And we're shocked when people don't exercise restraint when it comes to sexual ethics. So I think that is certainly something worth looking at. The other thing to point out that you will come across in these debates, right, is a lot of critics will say the church focuses excessively on these issues of sexual ethics. And I think if you look at many traditional or conservative Catholics, I think there's some truth to the idea that there is an overwhelming focus on the issues of abortion and sexual ethics as sort of the defining moral issues. Now, is that an inauthentic, or is that a problematic focus? Is that something that's wrong? I think you could certainly argue that these are very serious issues that need to be addressed, and they're very serious issues where the larger culture has taken positions clearly contrary to church teaching, which can explain a lot of why these topics are focused on. I do think it's worth reflecting on, though, that there might be other reasons why so many traditional or conservative Catholics focus on those issues as opposed to, say, greed or pride or the pursuit of power. And that for many of us, the issues of abortion or, say, same-sex relationships are easy to condemn because they're not things that we struggle with. They're not things that are part of our lives. And then if you look at this on socioeconomic terms, those are much more sins of the less educated and poorer classes. Statistically speaking, these kinds of problems and issues are far more prevalent in groups that have lower education and lower socioeconomic standing, right? So what we really have, from a critical perspective at least, is you have a lot of educated, fairly affluent, conservative or traditional Catholics who spend a lot of time critiquing the sins of the poorer classes, and very little time reflecting on the sins more connected with their own position, like greed, like pursuit of political power, or even things like gluttony, which they can treat in ways that the poorer classes can't through various medications or hiring a chef or whatever it might be. And so, again, this is not to say that the teachings on, say, contraception are wrong, but I do think it's worth reflecting on why do certain groups focus on these teachings as sort of the primary moral issue of our day. That might be a valid assessment of the situation, but from a view of a critic, it also does seem rather convenient that the sins that are the primary focus are not the sins that the people talking about all these things really struggle with the most. They're the sins of other people to a large extent. So anyways, I will wrap this up for now, and I look forward to, again, pick one or the other topic, but there's also obviously a lot of overlap, and I look forward to talking about this with you on Canvas and maybe with some follow-up videos.